On May the 27th, 1838, a Russian steamer called Nicholas I left St. Petersburg on its regular route to Lübeck. It had a good many passengers on board who were well known in the society of Moscow and Petersburg, such as Prince Vyazemsky, a well-known essayist and poet, the wife of the celebrated diplomat and poet Turgenev, and a number of other members of well-known families, Tolstoys, Golitsyns, and so on. It also had on board someone not known in that time, but destined to be a good deal more celebrated than these persons, Ivan Turgenev, the writer, then aged a little over 19, a student of philosophy who had completed his studies both in Moscow and in Petersburg, and had managed to persuade his mother to let him continue his studies in Berlin, which at that time was the most celebrated of all centers of philosophy in Europe. His mother was a difficult, very tiresome and tyrannical woman who alternately spoilt and tortured her son, and he had some difficulty in persuading her, but in the end she yielded. He was her favorite son. She didn't wish him to go abroad. But finally, in the midst of tears and after a special service in the cathedral for voyagers by sea, she took him to the boat, left him in floods of tears, and ended in a hysterical fit, which often happened to her. So far as we can tell, her son left cheerfully enough, played cards on board, and enjoyed his journey, his voyage, at any rate to begin with, a very great deal. When the ship was a few days out, it caught fire and was burnt to cinder. Very few persons lost their lives. Most of the passengers were rescued, as the fire happened about 1 mile from the North German shore at Travemünde, and almost everyone was rescued. How Turgenev behaved on board isn't clear, but that something had attracted the unfavorable attention of other passengers cannot, I think, be doubted. The first piece of evidence we have about this is a very typical letter which Madame Turgenev wrote to her son some months after he'd arrived in Germany, in which she said to him that, "I cannot understand your behavior," she said. "Why were only your lamentations noticed on the boat? Everyone here is talking about it. A great many people talk about it. It really isn't very agreeable to me. They all talk about ce gros Monsieur Turgenev, who lamented so constantly, who kept on complaining about dying so young. There's a Madame Tolstoy there, and a Madame Golitsyn there, and many, many others, ladies, mothers of families. Why are all the stories exclusively about you? That you are a gros monsieur is perhaps not your fault, but you behave with such cowardice that other people could have noticed it, in spite of all that panic. That has left a stain on you. If not a stain of dishonor, certainly one of ridicule." We don't know what actually happened, but it's quite clear that Turgenev must have behaved in a rather peculiar manner. Madame Panayeva, the wife of an old friend of Turgenev's, a literary woman herself, and the wife of a well-known Russian literateur, it's true she's malicious and not fond of Turgenev and fond of gossip, but still, I suppose her diaries can't be regarded as altogether unreliable, told the story with great glee. She told the story of how she went to a concert with an old friend of hers in the country, and was pointing out various celebrities to him, among them Turgenev, and when he suddenly said, "But this is the very man who, when on board the Nicholas I, behaved so abominably, pushed women aside, jostled everyone, tried to push to the front, tried to get into the lifeboats in front of all the women and children, and kept on crying in a pitiful voice, how terrible it is to die so young." The same story was also told by Prince Vyazemsky, who was certainly on board, in a letter to a well-known Petersburg beauty called Madame Smirnova, who was a great friend of Pushkin and Gogol and the Emperor Nicholas I, who also recorded in her memoirs, and a number of other persons seem to have recorded this fact. There is no doubt that in the salons of St. Petersburg at that time, and those of Moscow as well, I dare say, the story was circulating that poor Turgenev lost his head completely and tried to get off the ship long before, in front of the women and children, in particular that he seized the sailor by the arm and offered him 10,000 rubles, saying that he was the only son of a rich mother who would know how to reward him. Well, this is the kind of story which it's very difficult for people to live down, and we could well imagine that Turgenev must have been troubled by it. At first, he didn't seem to take much notice of it. There's nothing about it in his letters or anywhere else. first reference to it we come across is in some years after the incident, in 1855, when he was staying on his country estate at Spassky with some literary friends, and they decided to write a little play for the benefit of the neighbors. And in one of the scenes of the little play, in which Turgenev acted himself, a fire breaks out. And Turgenev himself rushed onto the scene, saying, save me, I'm the only son of my mother." Well, this by this time was a very well-known line, evidently, because the whole audience burst out laughing. The rest of the play was apparently very poor and dull, and nobody enjoyed it at all. But this was a line that brought the house down. Well, it's not untypical of Turgenev to try and, so to speak, destroy the force of this famous sentence, which must have wounded him very considerably, constantly repeated by his friends and enemies, by turning it against himself in a typically ironical manner, which is very characteristic of Turgenev. All his life, he turned the points of other people's swords away by pretending not to mind, or by drowning it in some kind of soft irony of his own, and turning it above all into literature, into art. Again, we don't hear about the episode for about 12 years, after which a man called Prince Peter Dolgorukov, rather a bad hat, he was a political exile who suffered for his convictions, but also at the same time the man who almost certainly wrote the famous anonymous letter to Pushkin, which caused Pushkin's duel and death. And it's difficult to think that he didn't know that was going to happen. From all we know about him, he really was a complicated and sophisticated scoundrel who enjoyed placing both his friends and his enemies in difficult situations. Well, Dolgorukov, who made a certain amount of money by publishing libelous genealogies of the Russian aristocracy, and I dare say by blackmail as well, published some interesting memoirs, in the course of which he tells this famous story about Turgenev's cowardice when he was 19. Even then, Turgenev might have let it go by, but some reviewer in Russia, in reviewing this book of memoirs, quoted this story rather maliciously, ostensibly in order to show what a liar Dolgorukov was. But once it began to circulate in Russia in a printed version, he felt he had to do something, and so he wrote a letter to the newspaper saying that he hadn't done it. He says, what he said was that he didn't wish to pretend that he wasn't perturbed by this prospect of death at the age of 19, but he didn't actually speak the famous sentence in question. That had been invented on the next day by a witty prince. It doesn't tell us who. Anyway, not by Dolgorukov himself, and anyway, it wasn't true. After that, the thing dies down again. Vauguet, who, of all the foreign observers at the time, knew most about Russian literature, tells us that his friends often tried to persuade Turgenev to write down this particular episode, to describe what really happened, and that Turgenev never wanted to do that. From, so Vauguet says, some superstitious fear of death, or superstitious reluctance to describe an episode in which he came so near death. Well, that's not a very plausible explanation. I don't know that there's much evidence that Turgenev had a particular terror of death, greater than that of other people. He had a terror of disease, certainly, but that's a different matter. At any rate, what did happen was, in the very last year of his life, in 1883, when he was very ill in Bougival, where he lived with his friend, the celebrated contralto singer, Madame Pauline Viardot, he decided to write the story down. He dictated it in French to Madame Viardot. He was suffering from cancer of the spine and was in appalling agony most of the time. During the lucid intervals, he dictated the story, which he called A Fire at Sea, an incendie en mer, which he dictated it in French about 3 months before he died. A Russian writer called Madame Lukanina, who is not otherwise known, translated it into Russian. He read through the Russian translation, complained there were a few Gallicisms in it, but on the whole he thought it would do, and it was published very shortly after his death in September 83, both in the collected Russian edition of his works and in the French edition. At last, the story was told, exorcised, so to speak. The thing I think which one feels most of all about it is that here was something which festered inside him all his life, which came back to haunt him at intervals, which malicious people used to taunt him with. All his life, Turgenev was suspected by his friends of having a weak character, of being a coward, of not daring to come to either side, of sitting on the fence, above all, of showing a certain lack of spirit in crises, whether personal or moral or political or whatever kind.